Unit 15, Part 7. So I'm quoting from page 281 from Klenk. We're talking about universal generalization. Universal generalization, the hard rule, requires the use of a flagging subproof. Right? It's the only one of the four rules which requires a subproof. Subproofs, we know them from conditional proof and indirect proof from Unit 9. Right? Like that, we've got a subproof indented. She talks about how similar the flagging subproof is to conditional proof and indirect proof subproofs. We're going to require, for the use of UG, that is, for the step from the instance to the universal statement, it's going to require the quarantining, as she says on 281, of the flag subproof. Hey son, don't come on YouTube, you're naked. Okay, it's going to require, no me, come on, please lecture. Thank you. Okay. Right, so this is what the flagging subproof is going to require, right? It requires setting up, so this is the formal presentation of UG as presented on the top of 282, right? So this is the full, right. Remember we started with the preliminary statements of what these rules were. This is the full statement, the full formal presentation of what UG is. If you're asked, give a formal statement of what UG requires, this is what you give, right? This is the main line. On the main line, you derive this universal statement. What you have to do, so this flagging step, and we'll see how it goes in practice on this one in a minute, you have to set up a flagging subproof, which means you have to draw this subproof, right? So in practice, you will be using UG, right? It's the generalization rule, so most of the time it's to derive the conclusion of the proof you need. When the conclusion of the proof you need is a universal statement, you think, oh dear, I'm going to have to use a flagging subproof. I'm going to have to get that conclusion by UG. I'm going to have to set up a flagging subproof before I do any universal instantiations. Let's talk about that in a minute. But this is what you do. You have to quarantine the instance from which you're doing the inference, from which you're universally generalizing. You do so by destroying a flagging subproof, and this is a step, right? You write flag A, the justification is FS brackets UG, flagging step for universal generalization. Important thing about this is this flagging A here counts as A appearing in the proof, right? So A has appeared in the proof, and that's how this restriction, the fact that the restriction which says we can only do a universal generalization if the instance from which we're generalizing has occurred within a flagging subproof. So that restriction prevents inferences like this from going through, right? I'm only allowed to infer from this instance to this universal generalization if this instance has been derived within a flagging subproof. Well, if I set up a quarantining flagging subproof, right, and I write flag A, right, say I do it right here. I write flag, this is a premise, right, so I write flag A as step 2, before I do any instantiations. Now I try and do an existential instantiation, and I do A and S, A, E, I, flag A, oh, I've broken the rule for flagging, I've broken the first rule of flagged instances. The instance A is not new to the proof because it has appeared in the flagging subproof, right? That's how you get what we want, which is preventing the inference, preventing universal generalizations, preventing that inference, preventing the inference from a particular instance to a universal statement when the instance has been derived from some existential statement, right? So that's how you block the two. You don't allow the two flagging rules to go together, as it were. You've got this is a flagging rule, so you have to flag that instance. But to get from some instance to the UG, it's got to come within a flagging subproof, and they don't. You can't put them together, right? So if you did an EI and now you try to set up a flagging subproof, so different attempt to get this inference we don't want to allow ourselves to get than the one I said before. If I did this step 1, step 2 as so EI flag A, that's legal so far. But if I'm going to do a universal generalization to get this, I have to set up a flagging subproof and derive the instance from which I do the UG as the last step in that flagging subproof. But now I try and write flag A, right, at the top of my subproof. I try and write this part. I can't, because then A is not new to the proof. A has already appeared in the proof at step 2, right, with the EI. So A is not, I could write flag B, but then I can only infer from an instance that's true of B, right, like A lowercase b and S lowercase b. And I can't get all that information together. I can't make that inference. So now let me reiterate what she says. So I quoted the very important from 281, fourth paragraph, the kinds of inference, the kinds of instances from which it is proper to infer universal propositions are those that would hold as well for any other individual. In practice, this usually means those that were derived entirely from universal propositions, right? So what kind of instances is it legitimate to universally generalize from? Something is true of this individual, so therefore it's true of everything. When is that legitimate? Only when the things which we've said are true of that individual are really true of all individuals. Then it will be a valid inference. And in practice, that is, when you've got a bunch of universal statements, like these propositional functions are true of all things, right? Then you can do universal instantiations, get to some formula which is true of some individual, and then it is legitimate to infer from that, to universally generalize from that instance, right? Now, that desire, that quarantining desire, or the desire to have the individual from which we universally generalize have things true of it which are true of any individual, any arbitrary individual, that's achieved by the flagging subproof restriction, because when you we set up the flagging subproof, that's flag A, you write flag A has appeared in the proof. Now, what can you do within the subproof? In practice, you can only do universal instantiations, right? You can only instantiate to the letter A, right, from quantified statements which are universals. You can only do UIs, basically, within a flagging subproof. You can't do any EIs, or if you do EIs, you've got to instantiate to a different letter. You can't instantiate to A. To keep the EI, the EI information, right, the particulars, the things which are true of particulars coming from existential statements, they won't be true of the instance from which you do the universal generalization, right? So look how it works in practice. So when will you be using UG? Okay, it's the hard rule. It's the harder of the hard rule. What's really hard about it is you have to anticipate its use before you do anything else in proofs. Oh, I should have said. Okay. Right. We're now in the context of the second of two easy before hard strategy tips, which is set up for UG before doing an UI, right? It's always do the hard rule before the easy rule. The easy rule in practice is UI. The other easy rule is existential generalization. You don't have to worry about that too much. It's sort of, you do it at the end of the proof, usually to do it to get quantified statements. But here the second of the two easy before hard, sorry. I just gave the whole wrong lecture. This should say hard before easy. I'm gonna kill myself. Hard before easy. Jesus Christ. I can't redo the whole thing at a time. You do the hard rule before the easy rule. You do the hard rule before the easy rule. You do the hard rule before the easy rule. I'm so sorry. Good Lord. Okay, it's hard before easy. You do the flag rule before the easy rule. Okay. Okay, let's keep going for now. Okay. So the second instance of hard before easy is you set up for the universal generalization before you do the universal generalization. So in practice, you're looking at something like this, right? Cx. Okay, so you've got these two universal statements, right? You're basically only going to be doing a UG when your premises are all universal statements, right? So you have to remain conclusion driven, right? You have to set up for the flagging subproof, set up for UG before you do UI. Do the flagging subproof, right? Write the flagging step, FS for UG, before, that's what this big thing was, before you universally instantiate from these. Okay, so you have to remain conclusion driven. You have to look at your conclusion. You see that it is a universal statement. Oh no, how do I get these rules? It's always the same thought, right? What is the form of this rule and what form is my formula? It is a universal statement. What rule allows me to derive formulas of that form? Oh dear, this is a universal statement. It has to be universal generalization. That's the hard rule. I have to do hard before easy. Hard before easy. I have to set up the flagging subproof before I do the universal instantiations. So right here, this is what I do in order. I've got my two premises, but I have to write as step 3, flag A, right? Flagging step brackets for universal generalization, right? That's A appearing in the proof. Now, as I said before, for EI before UI, be confident that universal instantiation is an unrestricted rule, right? And you can universally instantiate to an instance which has already been flagged. It's an unrestricted rule. Universal instantiation is an unrestricted rule. 4 and 5. So for UI, by the way, this is the proof that we've been aiming at for the entire course. All cats are mammals, all mammals are vertebrates. We're finally going to prove that all cats are vertebrates, all right? 3, so this is a step of its own, flagging step for universal generalization. Now I do these two instantiations, C, A, hook, M, A, 5 is M, A, hook, V, A. What I should have said is when I'm working on this and working backwards, universal generalization universal generalization is analogous to conditional proof in that, if you recall, with conditional proof, you look at your conditional and what do? You set up for the flagging, you set up the subproof and you assume the antecedent and you put the consequent down the bottom. Something very similar is true of universal generalization, right? You see that you need to do a UG. You know you're going to get this by UG, right? So you have to set up a flagging subproof, that is the setup for UG before you do UI, right? But like how in conditional proof you put the consequent down the bottom, you can put the instance that you need to get to complete your subproof down here, right? You just think instantiation backwards. Generalization is the opposite of instantiation. If this was a premises and I was instantiating, of course, it would be CA, hook, VA, right? So I should have done that first. That should have appeared before I did these ones, right? And that tells me where I'm going, right? I know when my subproof has finished. When I derive this instance within this flagging subproof, I'm entitled to universally generalize from it, since the quarantined individual A is such that if it's a cat, then it's a vertebrate. All things are such that if they're cats, then they're vertebrates. All right, and I've got these two UIs, and I can just hypothetical syllogism, right? Those are identical. If CA, then MA. If MA, then VA. HS, hypothetical syllogism, gets me there. Also, you could do a conditional proof in there. Right, good stuff.